Namaskar viewers, hello and welcome to Sunset TV. I am Tina Jha, you're watching Perspective. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese begins his 4-day visit to India on Wednesday. He will arrive in Ahmedabad on the 8th of March, the day we celebrate Holi, and so he is expected to participate in a Holi celebration in the city. Besides, he is also scheduled to watch the India-Australia cricket test match with Prime Minister Narendra Modi before heading to Mumbai to engage with the business community. And from there, he will travel to New Delhi to hold bilateral talks with Prime Minister Modi. So what will the talks focus on? What are the key issues that will top the agenda of the bilateral talks between the two Prime Ministers? Also, how significant is this visit of the Australian Prime Minister to India in context of further elevating ties between both nations? We'll try and understand all this and much more about the blossoming India-Australia relations in this edition of Perspective. And for this, I'm pleased to welcome on the program three distinguished panelists. Former Ambassador, Mr. Navdeep Singh Suri. Ambassador, thank you for your time. Welcome to the program. Ms. Natasha Jha Bhaskar, she is Executive Director, Newland Global Group. Ms. Bhaskar, welcome to the program. And Professor Harshvi Pant, Vice President, Studies and Foreign Policy, ORF. Professor, delighted to have you back with us on the program. Ambassador, let me begin the program today with you. So what are the key things to look out for in this maiden visit of the Prime Minister, the Australian Prime Minister, since he assumed charge? What's going to top the agenda on his 4-day India visit?
I think there are 4 or 5 key areas that come to my mind. The first is probably on the economic side. We've signed the economic cooperation and trade agreement, but there is a need to really put energy into it. And the fact that the Australian Prime Minister is coming with a large, fairly heavyweight business delegation gives us the opportunity to translate some of those intentions into real action. And I certainly hope to see that, because I feel that Australian business has been relatively conservative in its approach towards India as compared with the Canadians, the Americans, or the others. And that's also true for the Australian pension funds, the superannuation funds. The second is defense. We've moved a long way in terms of our defense cooperation. And I think it's really significant that the Malabar exercise, which started 30 years back as an India-US bilateral exercise, has grown in scale, grown in complexity, to a point where Japan and Australia are now regular members. And the next Malabar later this year is going to be hosted in Australia for the very first time. So it's really emerging kind of as a quad part of the naval exercises. So I think that's pretty significant. The third is education. And apart from the well-known fact that Australia is a very popular destination for Indian students, I think I'm very encouraged by the fact that Australian universities are being amongst the first to take advantage of India's new education policy. I had recently met the Vice Chancellor of Deakin University, and I was delighted to learn that they are going to be the first foreign university to open their campus in a gift city in Gujarat. So that really creates a new dimension to the relationship. And fourth, I think, is really, we keep talking about supply chain resilience in the wake of the pandemic and the disruptions that it caused. With Australia now, we have a serious conversation going around critical minerals, particularly lithium, which is so crucial to our own ambitions in India for e-mobility. And so I think this visit will probably give some momentum to those conversations about how Australian lithium can be processed in India and can be used to increase India's electric battery capacities for our e-vehicles. And finally, the elephant in the room when India and Australia speak is always China. And I'm sure there are going to be a lot of candid conversations about China's very aggressive posturing in the region.
So several aspects that Ambassador you've spoken about, which could be discussed and, which form part of the comprehensive strategic partnership between India and Australia. We'll discuss them one by one with other panelists as well. But before that, Ms. Natasha Jha, let me come to you. What's significant and what's striking also is the fact that on his maiden visit as Prime Minister to India, the Australian Prime Minister is being accompanied by a high-powered business delegation. Now, how significant, how crucial is that? And in terms of expectations, what are the opportunities, what are the new things that we can expect in terms of the business engagements and the larger ambit of trade and investment?
Hello to Professor Pant as well as Ambassador Suri on the other side, joining you guys from Sydney here. Now, in terms of, the points which Ambassador Suri has made, very pertinent from the perspective of what's really expected from this particular visit. Now, on your question, I think, Tina, Australia has actually embarked on writing a new economic engagement narrative with India. And there are several factors here. Of course, China's belligerence and the pandemic crisis that we have witnessed. And the elevation in the ties in the last few years. So be it, the India economic strategy from the Australian government or the Australia economic strategy from the Indian government, the elevation of the relationship to the comprehensive strategic partnership, reinforced by a range of practical initiatives, be it in the areas of defense, maritime safety, security, critical minerals, water resources, skills and governance, space, migration and mobility partnership. But what's really the missing link in this relationship is economic partnership. We haven't really been able to enthuse or build that confidence in corporate Australia to engage with the India market. And there's several reasons for that. Do they really understand the India market? There are historical hesitations, anecdotal assumptions on that the market is very difficult to do business with. And that's where visits like these become extremely important. Now, if I just have to do some context setting. What has really changed in this relationship in the last 1 year specifically? And if visits are really, any metrics of engagement, in the last 14 months, we have seen the visit of 10 Indian federal ministers to Australia. On the other side, we have seen Treasurer Jim Chalmers, who was recently for the G20 finance ministers meeting. We have seen Education Minister Jason Clare, who was there, with a strong delegation. We have seen Foreign Affairs Minister Penny Wong and Assistant Minister Tim Watts visiting India. Now, this particular delegation, which Prime Minister Albanese is bringing to India, it includes the representation from ASX 200 companies. Now, what are these Australian listed 200 companies? That means companies ranging from $380 million to over $100 billion, which actually accounts for 82% of Australia's share market capitalization. It includes companies like Macquarie, Fortescue, Qantas, Wesfarmers, Commonwealth Bank, ANZ, BHP, BlueScope, Cochlear. Now, if I have to put the market cap of these companies together, it actually exceeds, Tina, by $900 billion. And these companies are not just big players. They already have existing presence in India, but they have the capacity to inspire the existing corporate Australia's hesitation. And that's why what we are seeing, the composition of this delegation is not just the big companies, but also, I would say, comparatively marginal players in the renewable sector, in health informatics, in architecture, in battery segments. And these include companies like Alcidion, GrainCorp, Quintus, Ventura, Recharge Industries, along with the representation of Business Council of Australia, Centre for Australia-India Relations, Minerals Council. So it's a very, I would say, influential and powerful delegation. But at the core of it, I really feel what really needs to be understood is how do we enthuse the corporate Australia to engage with the Indian market in a better way? How can they really increase their risk appetite and what it requires? I'm very happy to discuss more about this, as we go forward in the discussion. But at this stage, the aspirations are first to engage with the Indian CEOs and the Australian CEOs, which is through the Australia-India CEO Forum. And the second, focusing on targeted sectors of engagement, which can show us tangible outcomes. Let's go beyond the intent. Let's go beyond the symbol. Focus on what sort of investment is going to come, what sort of commitment is going to come from this particular visit.
Certainly. So there is a lot of potential, but let's wait for the tangible outcomes. Professor Pant, the thrust clearly is going to be on enhancing economic cooperation and also strategic aspect of it, given the important partners that both India and Australia are in the Quad and in the Indo-Pacific region. In that aspect, how do you see the Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's visit to India further adding momentum to the existing relationship? And we are all aware how India-Australia relationship has traversed a long way from divergence to now convergence on a lot of issues. We are helping each other develop. So from that journey on, how do you see this particular visit adding momentum, further momentum to the existing ties?
I think both Ambassador Suri and Natasha have talked about various aspects of this relationship. Broadly, if you're looking at the relationship today, the older paradigm of, the three C's, cricket, Commonwealth, curry has given way to another three C's, China, critical minerals and technologies, and climate. I think those three in some ways encompass a large range of things that looking forward can define the agenda. But I think today, if you're looking at the relationship, there is hardly any difference between geopolitics and geoeconomics. And in fact, geoeconomics is driving the engagement in substantive areas, and economic engagement in particular is being driven by this sense of greater comfort, trust-based partnerships. So if I think all the points that Natasha was making about why Australian companies should be in India, why they should be investing in India, has a lot to do with the fact that strategically Australia and India are perhaps looking at the region and the world through a similar lens. And it has been a long journey, but I think we have reached at the point where the two sides are fundamentally convergent on that idea. Now, even as the Albanese government has opened up new, communications with China, trying to address the sort of freeze that was there, diplomatic freeze that was there for a very long time. It is important for Albanese, and I think Prime Minister Albanese has made that point again and again, that we are looking to diversify, we are looking to engage other partners, and India therefore becomes a partner almost. He has talked of India on par with Japan and Korea, Republic of Korea, saying that, look, these are the partners that we want to take our economic journey forward with. So I think that in some ways sums up the geoeconomic dimension of the relationship, where if you have been able to get the geopolitics right, you are able to take conversations forward in a direction which perhaps I think was being talked about earlier, that you have to bring these companies, you have to show them why India means business, and I think that's the intent from India's side has been. India's, Ambassador Suri talked about the free trade, agreement, and I think that's the intent here. That look, India is now the fastest growing major economy. India is trying to get its act together. India is also trying to shed this idea of being a protectionist economy, and therefore it is willing to move beyond those staples that we are not signing these agreements, we are reluctant to approach certain countries. So I think as that sort of new phase of globalization in Indian economic mind space has emerged, Australia is one of the most important players for India, and I think that message gets across from the Indian side, and I think the Australian political elites get that. If the Australian economic elites also get it, I think that will be the real icing on the cake, and that will allow, I think, the two sides to move on these areas that the two speakers were talking about. That we have not really seen the kind of economic engagement that perhaps a lot of people have been expecting. Now, if we can get that geopolitical and geoeconomic puzzle together, pieces together, then I think a lot can be accomplished, and that perhaps is going to be the message of the Australian Prime Minister, and that will be the message from the Indian side as well. That we are intent on operationalizing these ideas, and therefore the delegation that is coming should be looking at this relationship not simply through the sense of, well, there are problems are everywhere, but I think how those problems have suddenly become opportunities because certain geopolitical developments have taken place, because India has moved in a certain direction, and because India provides certain kind of a space which I think very few countries in the world are willing to provide at this point.
Okay, Ambassador, taking on from what Professor Pant just said, both India and Australia are looking at the geopolitical scenario with a similar lens, and perhaps that's why we are converging on a lot of issues, be it on economic cooperation, be it on the security threat aspect also. But given the manner in which, our relationship has progressed over the years, would it be also right to say that it's China's provocative behavior in the last 2-3 years which has ultimately pushed Australia towards India also? And, with Australia now looking at India as an alternative marketplace which is full of opportunities?
I think China has definitely played a very important role. Let's not take away from the determination and commitment that the two governments have shown. And in Australia in particular, because they've had several changes in government over the last few years, one thing that has emerged quite clearly is the bipartisan consensus in Australia's own politics, where you first had the Liberals under Prime Minister Scott Morrison taking the lead in growing the relationship, and now you have the same happening under the Labour government of Prime Minister Albanese. But I think what China has managed to do is galvanize both countries and give an element of urgency to a relationship that might otherwise perhaps have meandered along at a more stately kind of pace. The urgency that you see, particularly on defense and security, also on trade and economics, on critical minerals, on cybersecurity. A lot of that agenda, I think, is driven by the really egregious manner in which China has acted. And it hasn't done it just with India. We are very familiar with what happened to us or with us in Ladakh. But while the attack on us was physical, the attack on Australia has been much more in economic terms, and China really exploited the fact that some 38 or 40% of Australian exports were going to China, to think that they could squeeze Australia. Well, guess what? Australians have shown remarkable resilience in standing up to the bullying behavior of China. They've actually won plaudits. But in the duration while this was going on, they have also created more space for their economy, as the Australian Prime Minister said, that they are principally a trading nation, and they've been actively diversifying their export markets. So whether it is Australian wines or other products that they were exporting previously to China, we might find some of them on our shelves. But also, India has an opportunity to replace many Chinese products on the Australian supermarkets and shopping malls, whether it is leather and footwear or clothes or apparel, accessories, furniture. For us, this is hugely important because many of these products in India are produced in the SME or small and medium enterprises sector. They are fairly labor intensive. And I think the background, which we don't often speak about, is that the economic cooperation and trade agreement with Australia really has the potential to support a lot of manufacturing jobs in India as we grow our exports. So, there is that aspect of convergence, not just between our economies or our polities on the global scale, but also how it benefits the Indian economy as we grow.
Absolutely. I think the economic cooperation and trade agreement in that aspect, Ms. Natasha Jha, has opened a lot of opportunities on both sides. But when you spoke about increasing the risk appetite, how willing are the Australian companies to do so? What are the potential challenges that they still face in looking at India as a viable marketplace?
I think the first factor here is, and the first block or the barrier that we have was how do we get into the market? How do we understand the market better? And I think what we did in April, and with the execution of the AI-ACTA agreement on the 29th of December last year, I think the first barrier is really off now. So there is now growing interest in the market from an export point of view, because AI-ACTA categorically says that the aim is for the Australian government to actually push the bilateral trade to around $45 billion by 2030. And that's very reflected in the tariffs. As Ambassador Suri mentioned, Australia is actually a trading nation. But for India, the AI-ACTA was the first trade deal with a developed economy in a decade, and its second trade deal in a span of 11 years. So this has actually given a lot of exposure to Australian exporters, I would say, to get into the India market, to understand and also scale their products, whatever they have, get into the Indian shelves in the retail sector. But coming to your question of how we can actually raise the risk appetite so that the Australian companies consider, India for its long-term investment, we need to work on certain things. First of all is the perception. How do we challenge the perception? How do we make mainstream the India understanding in day-to-day conversations that are happening here. And I think from that perspective, we recently had the Risina at Sydney, a very successful event, and which was actually opening up to the corporates, to the government sector, that why India is very important. You got to understand India, the new India, in a much, much better way. So lack of knowledge about new India, a fear also of the unknown in culture, politics, language, traditions. India is massive. 28 states, union territories. How do you actually understand which side of the market you should get into? How do you actually identify the JVs, the partnerships, the marketing, the distribution? So it can be very, in a way, a big thing for a market which is comparatively from any comparison very small. We're looking at a population of 27 million, so vis-a-vis 1.6 billion population, so that can be very overwhelming. So that's, I think, is another factor, fear of the unknown. Also satisfaction with the status quo. There is a strong sense of complacency. You don't really see a compelling reason to grow in other markets like India, also because you're happy with what you are getting here. Of course, Australia is a lucky country. For longer, they've been extremely, into exporting raw materials, and that factor actually continues. But now there's a growing realization that you've got to diversify. You've got to look at other areas. Also, transactional mindset, because there is a core focus on short-termism, focus on quick returns. And this transactional mindset actually discourages the interest in patience and perseverance-led markets like India. So there are several factors, and until and unless these factors are not understood in totality, it will be very difficult to do business, in a like India. And I also feel that the export lens, until and unless it's not backed by foreign direct investment into India, it will be very difficult for Australia to make that presence. And just to give you that figure, Tina, in 2018, only 0.6% of Australian outbound investment was allocated to India. Now, this is less than which was allocated to countries such as Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Bermuda, and PNG. So that should give you a context of where Australia is sitting with India in terms of outward investment. And that's a very strong benchmark to identify, is India a priority market for Australia?
Okay,
and that's where we need to really revive and reflect on the conversations which this delegation will be making when it is in India.
Right. So there's a lot of optimism
Tina,
ahead of the
visit.
visit.
Come on that, just to add a point to what Natasha very eloquently said. So, when I was High Commissioner in Australia, I used to make it a point to visit the superannuation funds, which literally are sitting on hundreds of billions of dollars in assets, which need a decent return. And so the argument that I would make to them is that India is the fastest growing economy, or one of the largest fast growing economies. And why are you not looking at India? And it was very hard to move them. I think barring Macquarie and a couple of others, most of them were content to invest money into Europe and the United States on very low returns, relatively. But they would rather be safe than get a higher return, is what their mindset was. And for me, the contrast is with the Canadians, of course, and Canada is a somewhat similar country. But you see how Canadian pension funds have invested literally tens of billions of dollars into assets in highways and airports and renewable energy and so on. Or the contrast with the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority and Mubadala from UAE, which again are putting in billions of dollars because they see the potential of the Indian economy. So I think what Natasha said, I just want to endorse that there is this easy-going, risk-averse mindset. And what we are hoping is that this visit will expose captains of industry. I really think that the governments, in a sense, have done their bit by creating a strong psychological motivation through the Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement.
Of course. So for now, Ambassador, there's a lot of optimism for now, but let's hope that there are concrete outcomes to discuss even after this important meeting happens. Professor Pant, the bottom line is that, the trajectory of growth in partnership has been good for both sides to gain, but there is no doubt that the potential and the future potential holds a lot for both countries. So, for example, as both Natasha and Ambassador spoke about. So, how do you look at the newer areas? In fact, Anthony Albanese himself said just ahead of announcing his visit that our relationship is good, but there is need to make it much more stronger. So, of course, there are newer avenues that both sides are looking for. But in terms of further strengthening, further elevating our ties, How do you, and which are the areas that you see both sides engaging more proactively in?
I think, climate would be one of the areas where certainly we can look at a lot of movement forward in the coming years, because that is one area where certainly there is a degree of convergence between both as India moves into an economic framework where sustainable development and climate action becomes the driving mantra. And of course, Australians have taken the lead in some areas which are quite interesting and quite important from India's perspective. So I think that is certainly going to be an area which is going to go forward with renewed vigor. I think education is certainly doing very well, but education also needs to, I think, come as was talking about Australian universities being first off the mark in some ways in taking those opportunities that India is now offering. Now again, the issue is sustainability. The issue is how many others will come, but all the issue is also whether the Indian middle classes will continue their trajectory towards Australia as they have shown in the last few years. There has been a massive increase in the numbers. Whether those numbers continue. So I think education is certainly going to be one of the drivers, because I think as we have been discussing, the relationship has been, of course, top down in a sense that both governments have invested, the elites have invested, but also in some ways we have seen very interesting developments in the sort of bottom up engagement, that there is a level of communication happening at multiple levels now between India and Australia that a decade back was simply it was impossible to even find with a microscope. So you have academics, think tanks, universities engaging much more substantively on India on both sides. I think there is a broader point here, which is that for many in Australia, India is still far away. I think if you look at the political elites themselves, there is still this sense that they don't get India, apart from a few that are invested in the relationship. So you will always have the top leaders invested, but you don't see that percolating down to the wider community of the political class. And I think that speaks to this issue of understanding in knowing India, and that is changing. I think Natasha talked about Raisina at Sydney, but there are other things that are also happening in terms of the India centers being being supported by both governments and how those centers of academic excellence talking to each other. So I think at a number of levels, both in India and in Australia, we need that sustained engagement. The trajectory has been in some ways very, very spectacular because in 15 years, we have seen this relationship changing dramatically. Right. Of course, thanks to some great ambassadors like Ambassador Suri, who have done an excellent job. But also, I think, to the sense of what we were talking about earlier, that strategic convergence had become much sharper. But I think broadly, it still remains a relationship where there are so many loose ends to tie. And Prime Minister Albanese's visit is a reminder that regular exchanges continue to be very, very important in sustaining the momentum that this relationship has achieved. And I think the fact that Prime Minister Modi will be visiting Australia later this year, and then Prime Minister Albanese will be coming here again for G20.
Absolutely, his second visit this year.
Is for the G20 summit later this year. So I think there's another sign that these kind of sustained engagements are only going to be good for a relationship that is growing, that is flowering, and I think that is something that we need to put our efforts towards. Even as we relish the fact that it has grown, we need to continue to see where the opportunities lie and how they can be harnessed for the future of this relationship.
Absolutely. There's much more potential to further elevate the strong ties that we enjoy between India and Australia. So we'll have to leave it at that. Thank you, Professor Pant, Ms. Natasha Jha and Ambassador Suri for joining us on this edition of Perspective, sharing your thoughts, your views with us and our viewers. And to you viewers, thank you very much for your time as well. I'll see you same time tomorrow now. Take good care of yourselves. Keep watching Sunset TV. Wish you all a very happy Holi.